It's February 13th, 2017. A day that, well, began like any other, really. In the small town of Delphi, Indiana, home to, around 3,000 people. But this day would take a truly dark and devastating turn. And that's why we're here. To take a deep dive into the tragic story of Abigail Williams and Liberty German.
13 and 14 years old, respectively.
Yeah.
And it's, as we begin, we have to remember the innocence that was lost that day. Abby and Libby,
Right.
two young friends, best friends, really, by all accounts, with, their whole lives ahead of them. Abby was, I guess you could say, quieter, more reserved. She loved her art, enjoyed playing volleyball. Then you have Liberty, the outgoing one, always with her phone, capturing everything around her.
It was a Monday, a school holiday.
Oh, right.
And the weather was, unseasonably warm for February.
Yeah.
Abby and Libby, they decided to take advantage of that, enjoy the day with a hike.
Yep. And
they chose the Moon and High Bridge Trail.
Yeah.
Now, when you hear trail, you might think, a nice path through the woods.
Yeah.
Right? This was different. The Mana High Bridge Trail, it follows an abandoned railroad trestle. It's 60 feet above Deer Creek.
Wow. That's pretty high up.
Yeah, and for local teenagers, it was a bit of a dare, a place to test their courage,
That old trestle, I mean, can you imagine? The weathered timbers, that height, must have held a certain fascination, for these young adventurers.
And tragically, Libby, she documented their outing. At 2:07 p.m., she posted a photo to Snapchat. A picture of Abby on the bridge. It's a seemingly ordinary image that would become the last known photograph of Abby alive.
Chilling.
Libby's father, Derek, was supposed to pick them up a little after 3.15.
3.15 comes and goes. The girls aren't there. Derek's concern, well, you can understand, it starts to grow. He's calling, no answer. And as the afternoon turns into evening, that concern, it escalates fast. It leads to a search that, no parent wants to ever have to go through.
And that search ended in heartbreak the next day, Valentine's Day, February 14th. The bodies of Abby and Libby were discovered. Less than a mile from that bridge, in a secluded, wooded area near Deer Creek. The details when they emerged were brutal. Both girls had their throats cut.
Yeah. During the trial, it came out that Libby's wound was about 3.5 inches long. Abby's was less deep, possibly inflicted with, a different kind of blade, maybe a box cutter or a serrated knife.
It's just awful.
I know. And the blood spatter expert, his testimony, it offered this glimpse into those final moments. The evidence suggested that Libby was actually dragged. After the fatal wound, there was blood found on her foot. Those kinds of details. I mean, they really underscore the sheer violence of this attack.
And to add to the horror, the crime scene, it appeared to be staged. Sticks and branches arranged over their bodies, deliberate, almost ritualistic. Libby was found naked. Abby was wearing Libby's clothes.
Investigators, they didn't find any evidence of sexual assault. But the brutality of the scene, it speaks volumes, doesn't it? It tells you something about the perpetrator's state of mind.
Absolutely. Now, amidst this awful discovery, an incredible piece of evidence surfaced. Libby's phone. She'd managed somehow to record a short video. It was grainy, but it showed a man walking on the bridge. He became known as Bridge Guy.
Yeah.
And even more disturbing was a brief audio clip that was captured. Muffled, but the words, they were chilling. Guys down the hill.
That phrase, I mean, it's haunted this case ever since.
The impact on Delphi was immediate, and it was devastating. This was a place where violence like this, it felt impossible. And suddenly they're confronted with this unthinkable act. Fear gripped the town. You had vigils, and the search itself brought people together, but in this shared grief and this desperate need for answers.
And then for the next 5.5 years, the Delphi murders, they remained officially a cold case. But the public, they never forgot. The Bridge Guy video, despite the quality or lack thereof, it became an obsession for so many people. This puzzle they desperately wanted to solve, they pored over every pixel, every frame.
The video and that audio clip, they were released to the public on February 22nd, 2017. The description of the man, he was wearing a blue jacket, jeans, a cap, stocky build.
Yeah.
5'6" to 5'10". That image and those words, guys down the hill, they became the focus of this massive investigation.
But then, to complicate things, authorities released 2 different sketches.
Right.
The first one, in 2017, showed an older man. But then in 2019, they released another sketch, this time of a much younger man. And this discrepancy, it caused a lot of confusion, didn't it? Makes you think about, eyewitness accounts, how reliable are they, how those initial impressions can be. Well, they can be way off.
By 2022, law enforcement had received over 50,000 tips. That's an incredible amount of information to sift through.
It's a testament to, I guess, how much this case resonated with people.
Absolutely. Investigators followed so many leads, but so many of them, they just led nowhere.
You had, for example, that Snapchat account, Anthony Schatz,
Right.
operated by a man named Keegan Kline. And he had actually known Libby. And this account, it raised concerns because of, his online interactions with underage girls.
Right.
But they never found a direct link to the murders.
Yeah. And then early on, there was another man with a history related to child pornography who was investigated.
Right, right.
But he was cleared.
So, you have all these false leads.
Yeah.
And it really underscores how challenging this investigation was. This massive amount of information and trying to find those credible leads.
And, we have to acknowledge the role of, the true crime communities.
Yeah.
Online forums, podcasts, all these places, they became meeting grounds for, these amateur sleuths, individuals who were really invested in the case, analyzing every single detail, every piece of information that was out there.
I think it shows how technology has changed things, right?
For sure.
Citizens are able to participate in these investigations in ways they never could before.
Absolutely. And then in September of 2022, there was this break in the case. A retired state worker, Kathy Shank, she was volunteering her time to digitize all those tips and leads, that huge backlog, and she came across a mislabeled lead sheet.
Just by chance.
Yeah. And that sheet of paper, it had the name Richard Allen on it. A local man, he worked at the CVS pharmacy. It's amazing, right? Sometimes the biggest clues are hiding right in front of you.
You would think they would have cut that earlier.
You would. And here's the thing. Richard Allen, he had actually contacted the police back in 2017, early in the investigation. He told them he was on the Moon and High Bridge Trail the day of the murders.
Yeah.
So he was there to watch fish.
Watch fish?
Yeah. And for some reason, this wasn't really followed up on at the time. We still don't know why. I mean, it makes you wonder about how information's handled, especially early on in a complex investigation like this.
Yeah, absolutely.
It wasn't until October 13th, 2022, over 5 years later, that investigators finally interviewed Richard Allen again. And during that interview, he admitted to being on the trail. He said he saw 3 young girls, but he denied interacting with Abby and Libby.
Okay.
And then, this is a huge development, an unspent .40 caliber bullet was found at the crime scene between the bodies of Abby and Libby.
Wow.
And analysis by the Indiana State Police Lab linked that bullet to a Sig Sauer pistol owned by Richard Allen. This connection, and it was challenged later by the defense, but it became a central part of the prosecution's case.
It's fascinating how important that forensic evidence can be in cracking these cases open.
Definitely. And following that link, Richard Allen was arrested on October 26, 2022. He was 52 years old, married, a father, lived just 2 miles from the Mon and High Bridge.
And get this, he'd even helped the families of Abby and Libby print funeral photos.
I know. At the CVS where he worked.
It's a chilling thought that evil can really be lurking anywhere.
The case finally went to trial in October 2024 in Delphi.
Back where it all began.
Exactly. Special Judge Francis Gall presided over the proceedings. Richard Allen was facing 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of murder while kidnapping. The atmosphere in the courtroom was, it was tense. The jury was sequestered. People were waiting in line, sometimes overnight, just to get a seat in the courtroom. There was a gag order in place. No one could talk about the case outside the courtroom.
It's clear this case had a huge impact.
It did. The prosecution, led by Carroll County Prosecutor Nicholas McClelland, their case focused on a few key pieces of evidence.
Yeah, like his physical appearance.
Right. They argued that Richard Allen matched the description of the bridge guy from Libby's video.
And that unspent bullet.
Exactly. That and the connection to his gun, that remained a big part of their argument. They had expert testimony to support that.
Right.
But one of the most powerful aspects of their case was all the incriminating statements Richard Allen allegedly made while he was in jail.
Waiting for trial.
Yeah. Over 60 statements to his wife, his mother, a prison psychologist, even corrections officers. The prosecution argued that these statements, taken together, painted this clear picture of his guilt.
And there was some pretty disturbing testimony from Dr. Monica Wallace. She's a psychologist who evaluated Allen in prison.
Right.
And she testified that he confessed to the murders in April 2023. He was on suicide watch at the time.
Wow.
And he said that he had planned to sexually assault the girls, but he changed his mind when he saw a van passing by. The prosecution thought that van might have been driven by a man named Brad Weber.
Hmm.
And after that, well, Allen supposedly forced the girls across Deer Creek and then killed them.
So that testimony, that gave the prosecution a possible motive.
And a more detailed account of what might have happened.
Right. And then the prosecution also brought up Richard Allen's Ford Focus.
Oh, right.
They said it matched the description of a vehicle that was seen near the trails around the time of the murders.
It was circumstantial.
It was. But the prosecution, they used it to further connect Allen to the scene.
Now, the defense team, led by Andrew Baldwin and Brad Rossi, they mounted a pretty strong defense.
They did.
A big part of their argument was the lack of DNA evidence. They said there was no DNA connecting Richard Allen to the crime scene.
Right.
None of his DNA was found on the girls. And none of their DNA was found at his home or in his car. I mean, that's a big deal.
It is. And the defense also challenged the reliability of those alleged confessions. They said his mental state, it had really deteriorated while he was in solitary confinement.
Right. He spent 13 months there.
And they presented evidence that he'd been diagnosed with psychosis, that he was being forcibly medicated with Haldol.
Which is a powerful antipsychotic drug.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the defense argued that, given those circumstances, anything Allen said couldn't be considered a reliable confession.
It makes you wonder, how much weight those statements should be given.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then, in the more controversial move, the defense tried to introduce what they called the Odinist theory.
This was interesting.
It was. They argued that the way those sticks and branches were placed on the girls' bodies, they resembled runes. These ancient symbols associated with Norse paganism.
And unfortunately, some white supremacist groups have adopted those symbols.
Right. So the defense, they suggested that this, along with the condition of the victim's clothing, that it pointed to a ritualistic killing by people in an Odinist cult. They even had a forensic pathologist, Dr. Roland Kaur, testify that the wounds on the girls indicated that multiple weapons might have been used.
Implying more than one person was involved.
Exactly.
But this whole line of defense was ultimately blocked by Judge Gull.
Right. She ruled the Odinist theory inadmissible. She said there wasn't enough evidence to connect it to Richard Allen or the crime scene. And that decision became a big point of contention for the defense, and they later used it as part of their appeal.
It's understandable why they would be frustrated.
It is. And after 17 days of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for 18 hours over 4 days. And on November 11th, 2024, they reached a verdict. Richard Allen was found guilty on all counts. Reports from the courtroom said that Allen didn't show any emotion when the verdict was read, but his wife, she was there, and she was visibly upset.
It must have been an incredibly emotional moment for everyone involved.
Yeah. The sentencing hearing was held on December 20th, 2024. And the families of Abby and Libby, they were given the opportunity to speak directly to the court.
About the impact this had on them.
Right. Libby's grandmother, Becky Patty, her statement was it was heartbreaking. She said, "I could never change my choice to let Libby and Abby go to the trails that day. I hope he lives with the same fear he caused them."
It's unimaginable, the pain they must be going through.
Abby's grandmother, Diane Erskine, she also spoke. She talked about the future that was stolen from Abby, all the milestones she'd never reach. She said, "I watched her friends graduate college and wonder how many great-grandkids were murdered that day, too." The prosecutor, Nicholas McClelland, he praised Libby and Abby. He talked about Libby's bravery in recording that man on the bridge and Abby hiding the phone, preserving that crucial evidence. And then Judge Gull, she handed down the maximum sentence, 130 years, 65 years for each murder to be served one after the other. And Richard Allen, again, he showed no emotion. And none of his family members were present in the courtroom that day.
So justice was served. But, this story, it doesn't end there.
It doesn't. By January 2025, Allen's defense team, they had filed an appeal. They argued a few things, including judicial bias on the part of Judge Gull. They specifically pointed to her decision to exclude the Odinist theory, and they said she exerted too much control over the trial proceedings.
They also brought up the lack of DNA evidence again.
They did, and they expressed concerns about Allen's mental state when he made those alleged confessions.
Those are all valid points that the appeals court will have to consider.
Absolutely. And to add to the complexity, the defense, they've requested additional DNA testing. There were 3 rootless hairs found at the crime scene.
And they weren't a match for Abby or Libby.
Right. So as of March 2025, that request is still under review. And the results, well, they could have a huge impact on the case.
No question. And public opinion, it's divided.
It is. Some people firmly believe Richard Allen is innocent. They think there might be a cover-up, that other people were involved. But others are convinced he's guilty. They point to the confessions, the bullet, the forensic evidence.
So here we are, 2025. Richard Allen's behind bars. But the Delphi murders are still, well, they're still a mystery in many ways. Let's talk about some of those unanswered questions, those lingering mysteries that continue to fuel so much speculation.
Okay.
Well, let's start with that Odinist theory. The defense argued those sticks and branches on the girls' bodies, they look like runes, ancient Norse symbols. And we know some white supremacist groups have adopted those symbols. So their theory was that maybe this was a ritualistic killing by some kind of Odinist cult. And Dr. Kaur, that forensic pathologist, he testified that multiple weapons might have been used, implying more than one attacker. So the question is, why was Judge Gull so adamant about not allowing this theory in court? Was it more than just a lack of a direct link to Allen?
And then there's that strange timeline issue with Libby's phone.
Right. Her Apple Health app. It showed her last movement at 2:32 p.m. on February 13th. But then a digital forensics expert hired by the defense, Stacey Eldridge, she found data showing that a headphone jack was plugged into the phone at 5:45 p.m. and then removed at 10:32 that night, hours after the girls were supposed to have been killed.
Yeah. So who was using Libby's phone during that time? Was it a glitch in the data, or was someone else using it after the murders?
And then, of course, you have the two sketches.
Right. The first one, in 2017, showed an older man. It did look a bit like Richard Allen at the time.
It did.
But the second sketch, in 2019, it was of a much younger man. And the police, they never explained that difference. They never said who that younger man was. Was he a suspect they later ruled out? Or was the first sketch just wrong? We don't know. And it makes you question what happened in those early stages of the investigation.
And then Brad Weber.
Oh, right.
Remember, his van was mentioned in connection with Allen's confession. He first told police he was working, servicing ATMs that day. But then he changed his story. Said he left work at 2:02 p.m. and went straight home. That would have put him near the trails around the time the girls disappeared.
Yeah. So which story is true? And why the change?
Exactly. And then the big one, the untested DNA.
3 rootless hairs found at the crime scene.
Not a match for Abby or Libby.
And the defense is pushing for more testing. Those results, they could change everything. If that DNA matches someone else, Richard Allen might be exonerated, or could mean there was someone else involved.
So it's 2025, and we have a conviction. Richard Allen is serving 130 years. But his appeal is still going through the courts, and the DNA testing, well, that's still up in the air. This case is far from over.
While the conviction may have brought some closure to the families, their pain, it's still there. Becky Patty's words, the sentencing, they're a reminder of the incredible loss they've suffered. And Delphi, that town, it'll never be the same.
It's a reminder that, even in small towns, terrible things can happen.
So the question remains, was Richard Allen really the bridge guy? Was he the only one responsible for what happened to Abby and Libby? Or do all these unanswered questions, the timeline, the sketches, Brad Weber, the Odinist theory, and especially that untested DNA, do they point to something else, something more complicated?
That's a lot to think about.
It is. Imagine just for a minute what would happen if that untested DNA matches someone else. It would change our entire understanding of this case, wouldn't it? Yeah. And it makes you realize that even with a conviction, the full truth about what happened in Delphi,